But I'd like to begin by introducing a man who is one of my many former bosses and also the former editor-in-chief at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Tony Burman. He is somebody that is known to every journalist in Canada because of his long service at the CBC and his long service to Canadian journalism. He's currently employed at Jazerra. He spent more than 3 years in the news business, covered stories at home and abroad. He's always been a big believer in journalism as an agent for change. And that belief is tested and acted on many times over the years. Of the most famous that Tony's usually too shy to talk about is in 1984 when he and a CBC team of journalists, including our great friend Brian Stewart, captured footage of the famine in Ethiopia at a time when the world's media just wasn't there. Only the CBC was there. And Tony and Brian and his team were determined to show, what was happening there. And that was a fight then. It's a fight today to sort of convince people in your own industry and in your own office that this is bad. You need to see this. We must tell this story. He left his crew on the ground, smuggled their tapes out of Ethiopia, and put the story on air. It was broadcast, and I remember it well, and I'm sure all of you do, on CBC over several days, and then on the BBC. Bob Geldof in Britain happened to see it on television, and we all know what happened to famine relief for Ethiopia after that. The Live Aid concert, millions of dollars raised, huge amount of awareness raised. It was an amazing time, and I'm sure that informed Tony's journalism from that day forward. Today, his focus remains on global journalism. He's based in Qatar, where he is working to expand the audience for Al Jazeera English around the world. His challenge these days is to introduce his network to viewers in the Western world. And I look forward to hearing what his comments are for you tonight, so please join me in welcoming Tony Burman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be back here in Canada. It's wonderful to be in Vancouver at British Columbia. I was interviewed this morning by Rick Clough on CBC Radio, and he asked me if I missed winter here in Canada, and I said, no, I miss Canada. I don't miss winter. It's 26 Celsius in Doha, Qatar today. I won't tell you what it is in August. It was 52 degrees Celsius. However, today it's 26. When I'm back, and I usually come back for periods of a couple of weeks, I'm asked often as to whether or not I miss the CBC. And in some ways, I never left the CBC because I think what I am doing and what my colleagues are doing for Al Jazeera English in Doha, but also throughout the world. It's got, with the Arabic service, I think we have 69 news bureaus, which is more than the BBC, more than CNN. But what I think we are trying to do is very familiar to those of us who've been privileged to work at the CBC during its great years. And I think if the theme of today's evening is try to connect kind of Canadian values in journalism with coverage of the world, I mean, the Canadian values, as far as I'm concerned, are still very much at play in organizations outside of Canada, and I include Al Jazeera. I think that there's an openness to alternative perspectives that is, I think, uniquely Canadian. There's a lack of political baggage, that I think that I'm reminded as I deal, particularly with my Arab colleagues in Qatar, that Canadians are not identified with the turmoil, with the colonial history of many of the regions that are so tense and anxious these days. And I think there is a kind of a freshness that Canadians, almost against our will, bring to a lot of issues. I think Canadians also are, I think I'm discovering, are appreciated in ways that sometimes I think embarrass us. I always used to have an expression about the CBC that we kind of punch above our weight internationally. In other words, internationally, I think our reputation sometimes was seen to be really higher than I think some of us felt it deserved to be. And I think the same thing, to a certain extent, applies to Canadians. And I've had an incredibly, I've been with Al Jazeera for 8 months. I've had an incredibly kind of enriching experience as a journalist and as a citizen, as a Canadian, working in an organization that I think our staff is more than 45 nationalities from all over the world, not only from Britain, America, or Canada. And I think it's one that, that to a Canadian public broadcaster, it's incredibly invigorating. There are a lot of truly contentious and controversial issues that have arisen about Al Jazeera, particularly in North America. It's somewhat ironic that Al Jazeera English is a news channel that is now seen in more than 130 million households worldwide in more than 100 countries, but it's not seen at all in Canadian television, and it's seen only in a few locations in the U.S. So I think to a certain extent a lot of the controversies about Al Jazeera are restricted to North America. I think you find beyond North America that the so-called Al Jazeera brand is not only very popular but very respected. But there are controversies, and there are many issues that may surface tonight in our discussion that I'd love to take on. But what I'd like to do just for a few minutes is I'd like to just, in a fairly clear and brief way, is just describe what the channel's about, because I think one of the great frustrations of any of us who are associated with Al Jazeera is we know that most people in Canada, and certainly most people in the United States, have never seen Al Jazeera. They have no clue what it's all about. I have friends of mine here in Canada who think I dine every Friday night with Osama bin Laden. But I can assure you I haven't seen him more than a dozen times in the past week. I have another friend of mine at the CBC kind of emailed me and said, "Tony, you must be having so much trouble translating the Arabic into English, We didn't realize your Arabic was that good." It's kind of comments like that that just make me want to fall backwards. I think that when Al Jazeera right now is available, as I think some of the information is available on the internet, is available through livestation.com, and I'm hoping it'll be available as early as the fall here in Canada. But I'll get to that in a second. But I think to those who watch it, and there are a lot of people, and I notice there are actually people in this room who I hope confess that they in fact not only watch it but like it, that I think, if anything, you would find it very similar to BBC World in many ways. It's an international news channel that is proud of its coverage of the Middle East, but is exceptionally proud of its coverage of Africa, its coverage of Asia, Latin America. It's got an incredible popularity and respect now in Africa. Its coverage of Asia. So it's an international channel, and it's one that is really committed to the coverage of the world. I think a breakthrough for Al Jazeera English recently is something that I think has gotten a lot of coverage in international press. I'm not sure. I know the New York Times has done pieces on it, and certainly newspapers in Europe and elsewhere. And that's for Al Jazeera's coverage of Gaza. And its coverage of Gaza is I think, a kind of an example of what an organization like Al Jazeera can bring to the world. You'll recall the kidnapping of the BBC correspondent Alan Johnston, which happily ended with him being released unharmed. But the result of it, in terms of other news organizations, is they pulled all the reporters and their producers out of Gaza. And the effect was that there was no one covering Gaza except for Al Jazeera. And then the Israeli-Gaza conflict started, and the border was effectively sealed, and none of the foreign journalists based in Israel were allowed to go into Gaza. So Al Jazeera, for the 20 days or 21 days of that conflict, were effectively the only international English-language news broadcaster in Gaza. And what happened in Gaza was really a catastrophe in many ways. And